Well, young Canadians were a key focus of yesterday's federal budget.
Gen Z and millennials are the engine of our economy. Everything that is created, built, served, and sold in this country is increasingly being created, built, served, and sold by millennials and Gen Z. They're the young parents, the students doing cutting-edge research, the young entrepreneurs with startup ideas. Their success is Canada's success. In the future, sure, but also right now.
In the 416-page financial document, millennials and Gen Z were mentioned 21 times each, while young or younger Canadians were mentioned 38 times. So that's the word count, but what's actually in the budget that's going to count for millennial and Gen Z Canadians? Paul Kershaw is the founder of Generation Squeeze, a think tank championing generational fairness in Canada. Paul Kershaw, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
They've marketed this as one for fairness for every generation. When you look at the actual measures, I mean, what stands out for you that will achieve that big target?
Well, first, I would acknowledge that the promise to deliver generational fairness in and of itself is a game changer. I think there's a marked shift that we should recognize from the focus on the strong middle class to coming to today recognizing we need to bring a generational lens to see that class has been distorted in Canada. It's been distorted now based on how your age interacts with the housing system. And for those who got into the housing system sometime earlier, secure housing has then produced wealth. But for their kids and grandchildren who might have good incomes, that unaffordability of housing is really putting that middle-class dream of secure housing out of reach. And so I think you don't solve a problem until you name it, and it is historic to actually have the federal government name it and then reorganize fiscal policy accordingly. And you're like, Paul, but what about the details?
Well, yes, Paul, what about the details, right? Because there's a big promise there on housing, which is the number one thing, because even if you get a middle-class job and a middle-class salary, if you can't buy a home, you can't find a place to live, you don't feel middle-class, you don't consider yourself middle-class. So about those details.
So I hope to do housing and then a few others, but let's start with housing.
Yep.
I think it would be hard to deny now that this federal government has some of the most comprehensive housing policy that we've seen at the national level, certainly in some decades. And yet we're still going to have to beg for forgiveness from a younger demographic that they're going to have to be patient. Because it took decades to create this problem. And just to show my nonpartisanship, like under Prime Minister Harper, average home prices went up by 60%. Under Prime Minister Trudeau, they've gone up 54% more. That is very devastating for younger people, but that's taken many, many years, and no single budget can turn that around. But you have to acknowledge that the protections for renters, that the investments in new rental, the scale up non-market housing, the trying to discourage foreign buyers, the flipping and so on, these are all important parts of trying to solve the housing affordability problems. I would acknowledge this major weakness. Never once, does the housing plan acknowledge the word wealth. And if we don't talk about housing wealth, we don't understand why in Canada for decades we've been open to having home prices leave earnings behind, because people like me, I've been a homeowner for 20 years, I've gained wealth as home prices have risen, and I think that that is still a sticky topic that hasn't yet come into the budget conversation with generational.
But you know, the politics, if you touch, I mean, even in the capital gains increases they announced yesterday, they said primary residences will continue to be exempt. That will destroy any government forever that tries to do that, right?
And I wouldn't recommend that you do get rid of the principal residence exemption.
But that is part of the disparity, and that is the generational frustration that they see older people who own homes and the comfort that they have in their security versus the anxiety they have in their situation. So it is a comprehensive plan on housing, as everybody has says, but a lot of the levers to get it done are at the municipal and provincial level, which is a challenge for them. Labor supply is a constraint. So you said people need to be patient. The millennials are 40 almost, you know, a lot of them. I mean, how much more patient do you think they can be?
Well, I think no matter what political party comes into power after the next election or what happens at provincial levels, we're going to be begging patience for some time because we just tolerated the problem emerging for so long. But I think it matters to talk about wealth not simply because do we want to talk about the homeownership tax shelter, but because we need to recognize supply isn't the only factor, and we can actually work on the demand side issues more quickly. And if supply were the only factor, then Alberta should have higher average home prices than BC and Ontario because they have less supply per capita. But they don't. We all know that. And that's because in BC and Ontario, the wealth that has been accumulated more over time and been routinized over time gives people like me the ability to say, well, my equity's gone up, and I'm going to use that to bid up the price of houses and outcompete someone who just brings earnings without equity. And there's been more opportunity to do that in those two provinces. And we need to think about that sort of homegrown entanglement for regular folks that are contributing with their wealth accumulation through housing to increasing home prices.
But through all of this, and I don't know how you stop that. People using the equity they gain in a house to move up the property ladder. I mean, that's sort of what a lot of people have been able to do over the course of their lives. But, I spoke with Anne McClellan and Lisa Raitt, two former cabinet ministers, co-chairs of the Coalition for a Better Future. They've done lots of polling, and you got young people just losing faith.
Yeah.
So what is it that we saw yesterday? I appreciate the direction they have set, the aspiration they have set, but what is it you see from the government yesterday you think will maybe restore that faith?
So we built Gen Squeeze over a decade ago to try and acknowledge the grief that a younger demographic is feeling and said like, we need to restore faith through policy change. Housing's a harder one to fix quickly, but I'm absolutely delighted that after 50 years, we finally have a government that said we don't want childcare to be another rent-size payment. And that is something that this government is doing. They expanded it yet again in this particular budget, and they then are running a little bit into politics at some provincial levels. In my province, things are going more smoothly, although we could still have Mr. Eby do even more. I also think we should acknowledge that from a generational perspective, in the face of whopping political pushback that we were just talking about before the break, this government's standing by the principle that we pay for our pollution because we love our kids, and if we don't, we pass on just unbearable climate costs to them down the road. It's clearly not politically, easy to say that right now, but from a generational fairness perspective, that is quintessentially important. And last but not least, we asked when pushing this government to promise generational fairness to say, look, acknowledge what's driving the deficit. Because with all the announcements about housing and childcare and a school food program, people watching the news are likely to think it's all that new spending on younger folks that's driving the deficit. That's just rubbish. And the fastest growing parts of the federal budget are two line items: old age security and the Canada Health Transfer, half of which goes to the 20% of the population over 65. And that is so critical to acknowledge to understand the deficit.
There's another line item that's growing really
and
fast.
The interest
and that
on
is
the
debt servicing. Now, look, I know a lot of that is the result of what they did in COVID. Smaller provinces and poorer provinces couldn't bear the load, so the federal government took it on, and a lot of it is understandable or at least excusable. But the reality is it's going to go up to $64 billion a year by 28-29. It's 11% of revenue.
The only thing increasing nearly as fast as old age security is interest on the debt. There's no way to get around that. But we need to recognize what has been driving the debts that we're having. And it really has little to do with, here, I don't mean to be partisan, but it's just inaccurate when Mr. Poilievre says inflationary, wasteful spending of this government. What's the new spending growth is actually baked in from decades ago. We knew boomers were going to age.
But every time there's a windfall, it gets spent. Right? You know what I mean? Like every time the economy delivers more revenue, it gets spent rather than reducing the debt or reducing the deficit.
But it gets spent because every year the old age security budget is going up and up and up. Old age security is going up by $31 billion in a single year. The housing announcements are $2 billion. The child care is $3 billion. EI is going to go up by about $8 billion. Fighting climate change, $8 billion. $31 billion is whopping in it. We knew it was going to happen decades ago. In the mid-90s, we said we better prepare for the boomers' retirement by adapting CPP premiums, otherwise CPP will go bankrupt. Unfortunately, governments didn't say that about OAS and medical care, and now in the NDP-BC, they have a large structurally induced deficit.
Right.
In Ontario, they do as well, and federally here at the Liberals, they do as well. Notice my nonpartisanship.
Okay, all right. Paul Kershaw, we appreciate the insight as always. This is Paul Kershaw with Generation Squeeze. Thanks so much.
Have a great evening.